Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online panel discussion hosted by the Inclusion Initiative, TII. I'm Nikita, your moderator today, and I'm a researcher here at TII, and I'm also pursuing my PhD in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. I want to firstly thank Sasha Ogosi, TII's Public Affairs Manager, for organizing this event. Sasha will put info in the chat on how to follow TII on social media, how to subscribe to our newsletter, and contact us directly. Now, before we begin the discussion, I just want to lay some house rules. We will follow Chatham House rules to have an open and honest discussion. The panel discussion is divided into two parts. In the first part, I will ask a few questions to the panelists, and then in the second half, we will open the Q&A to the audience. Please use the Q&A feature to put your questions. It will be available, I think, on the bottom of your screen. And I will come to your questions later in the second half. Please also note that the event is recorded. So now let me welcome and introduce our esteemed speakers. First, let me introduce Dr. Anjhula Bais. Described by the Sunday Times as an activist, academic, and an aristocrat out to shatter myths surrounding mental illness and psychology, Anjhula is an international psychology trauma specialist, founder and director of a Fourth Dimension Consultancy, and the chair of International Board of Amnesty International. Next, we have Dr. Sakshi Ghai, who is a postdoc researcher at Oxford Internet Institute. Sakshi completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Cambridge. Her work is based on the effects of digital technologies on adolescent well-being and meta-scientific research into the diversity of behavioral science. Sakshi is also joining LSE as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. Congratulations. After finalized the panel, I realized that all three of us, me, Sakshi, and Anjhula, are actually alumni of Lady Shriram College, and we were just discussing how amazing is that. Last but not the least, let's welcome Dr. Grace Lordan, who is an associate professor at LSE and the founding director of TII. Grace is an economist and a labor market skills expert who has served on as an advisor on the UK government's sitting on their skills and advisory board. I also have the pleasure of working with Grace as she is my PhD supervisor. Thank you so much, Anjhula, Sakshi, and Grace, for joining us today. As we begin the discussion, I want to address the question that I have received the most since we announced this panel. What do you mean by weird? So, in the realm of global discourse, there's a significant imbalance of the representation of diverse populations. The term weird refers to individuals who come from societies that are typically Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and/or democratic, hence the acronym WEIRD. Despite being only about 12% of the global population, weird individuals or countries disproportionately dominate the narrative, overshadowing the vast array of experiences and perspectives from the remaining majority. In the discussion today, we want to explore the significance of moving beyond the focus on the weird countries in research as well as in organizations. We will delve into the reasons why this shift is crucial and discuss potential strategies for achieving it. Anjhula, given your extensive experience in working in various global contexts, have you observed that global narratives tend to be disproportionately centered around weird countries? If so, could you share some examples and the implication of this imbalance?
Yes, thank you, Nikita. The short tweet answer is absolutely yes. In my experience, the way it's manifested in sort of my human rights work and psychology work within several organizations is there, in terms of weird countries, there's sort of a normative standard setting in how one should act, how one should be, how one should think, how money is applied to when, where, how is sort of, dispersed, right? So right now, a central preoccupation of mine is in some of the organizations I'm working with is how are we sort of decolonizing money flows, right? There's sometimes something to be said in the humanitarian human rights sector about a white savior mentality. And the issue with all of this is obvious, but it's worth stating you lack diversity, right? And this is obvious, but it's sort of further disenfranchising the global majority. So, another narrative when we're talking these days a lot about DEI is kindness and civility. Obviously these are important things, but at whose expense? If we're going to actually get very serious about DEI, I'm not saying it's going to be accomplished by cruelty, not at all. I'm a very big believer of bridge building and diplomacy, but it can't always be kindness. I see a lot of times, not always, I'm not going to make a generalized statement, but in a lot of weird countries, it's sort of kindness and civility is premised over justice. It's also premised on this idea of othering, sort of civilizing the savages. Who benefits? A lot of times I see this idea of assimilating into whiteness and our culture, otherwise you're terrifying. So I try to encourage people to think, when these narratives come about and we surface them, are we too much or is someone being too less? And we really need to think about how we're going to galvanize change around economic inequality, racial equity. Fragility is a very real thing. And if we want better ideas and solutions in a space for everyone, it's going to continue to be out of reach if the sort of weird countries, if you will, dominate, even if subliminally.
And Anjhula, considering the shifting global landscape, do you see the narrative expanding to better represent countries with larger populations and economies beyond the weird categorization? And if yes, what factors are driving this change and what challenges might still be present?
Okay, so I'll begin with the short answer again. Tweet-wise, yes. I mean, there are changes, not enough, though I would argue, not fast enough. I feel that we're still working in silos, yet I think it's important to contextualize and encourage ourselves, obviously, through positive reinforcement. So, a lot of times, when we say what factors are driving this change, I mean, I think even micro actions. So, for example, where I did my PhD, the Chicago School, literally, when you think of sort of research, it's oftentimes white, heteronormative undergraduate sample size, right? It's sort of one size fits all. And in my doctorate program in international psychology, they said that the dissertation needs to be based on a country anywhere but the USA. And things like, even the use of spelling, why let's spell like the global majority. I do see changes like in terms of, in my field of sort of healthcare and adjacent medicine, indigenous alternative models of healing and therapy. It's increasingly more recognized. I live in Malaysia, for example, acupuncture is recognized by insurance. That's very interesting, though not mental health, so I'm not sure what to say about that. There is a growing humility based on the hard work of people before us, but I do wish it were deeper and faster. And, I think people are realizing they're not kingpins anymore, that, one shift has an outsized global effect, right? Be it Russia's moves or China and technology, and the interconnectedness too with the climate crisis is driving the urgency of change. So I think it's a silver lining. Yeah, and I will just say, if you can see it, you can be it. So I find it very interesting. Today I'm speaking at the LSE, and the UK has an Indian origin prime minister, and that's very interesting given UK's history with India.
Thank you, Anjhula, for your valuable insights. I'd like to switch gears and bring Sakshi at this point. Sakshi, the term non-weird encompasses more than 85% or even more of the world's population and risks oversimplifying the rich diversity within this category. How can researchers avoid oversimplifying or perpetuating stereotypes while ensuring a more nuanced understanding of these diverse populations?
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much, Nikita, and the Inclusion Initiative for having me. This is very special panel, but this is my first panel with LSE. But to your specific question, I think with the growing popularity of the WEIRD acronym, I think how researchers perceive the distinction between weird and versus non-weird, the label really matters. And actually, to your point, Joe Henrik, who's the coiner of this very clever acronym, his own definition of Western countries includes Northwestern Europe and British descent societies. So if you really, really look at it with a microscope, it only approximately accounts for 8% of the world's population,
Right.
leaving out 92%. And we're sort of with the WEIRD acronym almost painting this one homogeneous Western brush and flattening the understanding of human experience, if you will. Now, the first big strength of the WEIRD acronym is that it really nicely flips the Western hierarchy, that it draws attention to how psychological insights have been derived around West. However, the challenge with the dichotomization of weird versus non-weird is that outside of Western, non-Western, industrialized, it really misses sort of some of the key dimensions of diversity, such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Now, naturally, if it masks the extent of underrepresentation, you start to sort of wonder, who are we studying, even when we look at the sort of non-weird world, which is the low middle income countries. And if researchers there also typically end up studying, say, the digitally connected, English speaking, middle class majority, then that's also something to be said about. But to directly come to the question about how researchers can avoid, I think we have a really unique opportunity in the field right now to almost reimagine the future of human sample diversity. And I think starting with acknowledging and understanding and appreciating the complexity of human diversity that it is, and it's really hard to even measure in psychological research. So even gender is now no longer the same as we knew it was a few decades ago, particularly how it's become, how we've accounted for non-binary identities. Second, I would say, is really rethinking beyond the Western, non-Western comparisons and really accounting for within region diversity and within country diversity and really looking at the intra-population level differences within our participant demographics with the way we collect samples. And third, very briefly, I want to introduce this idea of questionable generalizability practices that sort of sit as an extension of questionable research practices, which sort of really get to the heart of us drawing larger conclusions about generalizability based on this very small sample. So I think the heart of it is really epistemic humility and how we can communicate that through our scientific reporting, through the way we write papers. And I'm sure we can touch a lot about that as we go through the panel discussion.
Thank you for that, Sakshi. Grace, I now turn to you. Research has shown that despite the global nature of organization, the diversity and inclusion efforts remain heavily influenced by Western perspectives. As an expert in inclusive leadership and diversity, what strategies would you say that global organizations can adopt to effectively shift focus just beyond the weird countries?
I think it's a great question. When I was listening to Anjhula and Sakshi talking, I was thinking about identification in psychology in particular, where a lot of the insights have actually come not just from weird countries, but from students in elite universities who are in weird countries. So even more, a smaller population than we might like to admit. So I think for me, the answer to this is diversity. So if you have a global organization, mechanically, you have global employees. So it doesn't make sense to have your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts driven from one region where people won't have experience of the context, they won't have experience of the frictions, they won't have experience about what would actually work along the ground. And I think particularly for a DEI, more than any other company policy, having some grassroots input is super important. And if you have a majority base in one country and you have lots of other satellite areas, it really is important on you to get the perspectives of those satellite areas before you're rolling out projects that aren't useful to them. And I think as researchers, we need to take that on as well and kind of think about when we interpret our results, not being like the people who've maybe gone before us and generalize them, but really thinking about where's my external validity, to what populations, recognizing that human beings in different countries do have different contexts, and context will ultimately matter for the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing strategies that work in organizations as well as research. On research, Sakshi, I would like to hear your perspective more. In your work on diversifying research samples, what strategies have you found to be effective in ensuring that research represents a more global population?
Yeah, actually, building on, I think, hearing Grace talk a little bit, I think I'll try to bring in a little bit more of a meta science, meta research perspective in, not only in terms of how we are rethinking psychology research more broadly, but also this new age of doing open science and even rethinking open science. But I think the first, which is the most effective or the easiest way, if you will, of improving diversity is actually improving the accuracy of how we report and communicate research findings. And this is particularly for researchers, because often one of the biggest challenges when we look at past published research is the challenge of overgeneralizations, if you will, or unwarranted generalizations. And understanding very well that we need to make a lot of tangible change to ensure contextual sensitivity is included in study results, but also just very simple things like even mentioning where the study was conducted, which sounds very intuitive, but there is research pointing to how we don't even mention the where the study was collected, even in our abstracts. So very small attentions that we can give to the way we communicate across the anatomy of a scientific article, starting from our title to our discussion, our limitation sections, and really taking head on the challenge of what are the constraints on generalizability? What is the intellectual humility that we are bringing to the table? So I would say that to begin with. I think the harder bit, which is, of course, we recognize, and now there's growing attention in the field that sample diversity or the lack thereof has been an issue and has been a very persistent issue. But of course, sample diversity cannot be solved, and it's really just the tip of the iceberg without rethinking not only the way we include diverse populations, so thinking more broadly on our methods, whether that's through qualitative or some other ways we can reach these diverse pockets of population, but also diverse theories. And I guess that begs the question of what even counts as diverse theory, because so much of psychological theories have traditionally relied on US as default. And then again, what is universal? And then global South focused, or a study in India or a study in Brazil might be seen as a more local theory versus a study in the US. Even if it's on a sample of 100 undergraduate students, it's just perceived to be more universal. And I think it's navigating that and really changing the status quo, which of course comes with researchers starting to pay more attention to the way we include socio-ecological variation in our design, in our research questions, but also rethinking collaborations. And I can sort of touch on that later if we do have time for that. But I'll stop here and really say that actually we really do have to do a bit of a rehaul in the way we are approaching or paying attention to diverse populations. And of course, it's the problem is clear, but I guess the solutions require coming together and really trying to ensure we can expand the toolkit.
Thank you for that. I always find it very intriguing that how theories or like culture based on a limited or like a smaller population becomes global, whereas the one which is based on a more larger dominant population becomes a local one. Grace, I want to come back to you, and because there has been a big debate that academic journals tend to favor publications based on research conducted in weird contexts. And as we have many early career researchers with us today, could you provide some advice on how to successfully publish work focused on low and middle income countries?
Yes, when Sakshi is talking about theory, I do wonder if theory is the biggest blockade to some of the things that we're talking about. So, medicine doesn't heavily rely on theory. They look to see what works and they document it across numbers of different populations, trying to figure out what they have in common and what are their differences. Whereas across social sciences, we try to take data and get it to fit a theory that has already been there, even if the data doesn't want to go into that theory. And for me, that's one of the problems I think that we're coming up against, that we have this kind of particularly American dominated theory that just doesn't fit data across the world. I think on journals, Nikita, it's getting better. So I think that's kind of the first thing to say. I think within disciplines, there is local journals that are coming up that are very high impact. So you and I wrote a paper with Gerald Wu that was that looked at a population of people living in China, and the China Economic Review has an impact factor of around 10. So again, instead of going for the American Economic Review, you can go for kind of the local country journals. I think the answer to this, which is very frustrating to me, is, you know, the people who define what's acceptable in a field are the people who are working in academia in that field, and the people who are in the higher ranking institutions as perceived by world rankings, which have lots of problems, tend to be the gatekeepers for the journals. So that's why it's really important that people like Sakshi come and work at the LSE and are tenured, so that we have diverse people who end up being gatekeepers in these really important journals. But that said, I think that there are a number of journals that are not just in non-weird countries, to use the title that you've put on the session today, but there's also field journals that are cropping up that are really welcoming of things that are outside the westernized context. So it's really a matter of targeting place and those journals that are willing to accept, and eventually becoming a gatekeeper yourself to one of the journals that ultimately are deemed the best in academia. So not the most optimistic answer, but much more optimistic than I might have been 10 years ago. And can I add one thing, which I think which I was amused when Sakshi was talking about people not putting the country in their abstract in psychology. In economics, it's actually a little bit worse. So if you wrote a paper, for example, how to improve productivity, that would be a full stop if your paper was in America. In any other country in the world, it would be something like empirical evidence from X, from the name of the country. You have to name the context, unless it's America, which is deemed to be a kind of a generalized, stylized fact. So again, kind of speaking to a lot of what Sakshi and Anjhula have said about, we just kind of accept these norms that are ultimately harmful for us learning about generalizability across lots of different contexts.
And Sakshi, Anjhula, do you want to add to the advice shared by Grace? Anjhula, do you want to start first?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, and I think it's fascinating, Grace, Sakshi, and I are essentially meeting for the first time, and we're in different facets, right? Right now, primarily, I'm concentrating on human rights, but there's just so much truth in what my fellow panelists are saying. I mean, when again, I guess, in terms of maybe adding, or let's say advice to people listening in. So clinical psychology is sort of, in a way, in a nutshell, its antecedents, especially psychoanalysis, global north, Viennese based, one size fits all. And international psychology's premise is that every nation state sort of has its own indigenous wisdom, and you have the best outcomes when you apply that. And it's very fascinating. And I would choose courses strategically. I think if you can, embedded with human rights, because that's really, whether you're talking about taxation or anything, there's that angle. Spar with your doctorate committee if you had to. I have, certainly, in terms of the topics, and they have some blinders on too, right? So, and again, my panelists, my fellow panelists, have sort of spoken about maybe some pitfalls, if you will, in publishing. It's beset with issues. Maybe thinking outside of the box, self-publishing, utilizing social media in a thoughtful, intelligent way to get your idea and discourses across could be a powerful start. Media too, right? Contacting journalists, and you need to make that connection and be persistent, drop by drop. I mean, at one point, so in what feels like a past life, but in this life, I was very involved in fashion and media, and it was, in a little bit to what Grace is saying, it's just a normative benchmark. Like, America doesn't have to identify itself. It's like these measuring yourself, right? Even in fashion weeks, it was always Russians and Europeans, but drop by drop. Now look at fashion weeks, look at the covers, look at the diversity, affirmative action. In Amnesty, it is a requirement on our international board that all 11 members have to be from different countries. It used to be so we have 70 country offices in, there's Amnesty UK, Amnesty USA, Amnesty India, Amnesty Brazil. And according to how much money the office was earning or how much, like the size of their membership, that's how many votes you got at the Global Assembly, which is pretty much second to sort of the UN General Assembly. And it was doggedness, where if we're going to walk the talk, then every office, whether you have 5 staff in Malaysia or 200 in some country, a weird country, everybody has one vote. And it was a seminal moment in Amnesty, that one section, one vote. And again, as strange as it might sound, it's what it's called sort of micro-feminism, right? It adds up to collective change. So small acts, I think in everyday life sort of embolden the idea that incremental actions are going to create systemic change, right? So let's say you're doing research, make it your own personal ethos or value that you partner with a BIPOC person, make that a priority. Calling it the global majority, like I said, spelling in a way that most of the world does. When you're speaking about a specialist or a smart person, and you're asking about what they did or said, instead of assuming it's a him, say, what does she say? What does she do? Why do we say women leaders? I'm a leader. I'm not a chairwoman. I'm not a chairman. I'm the chairperson. At little wins, but they add up. At Amnesty, our external auditors would always address the board as dear sirs. It took 2 financial cycles, but I had them change it to dear international board members. So when we take a stance, right, against sort of these pernicious habits, and ways of being that we think are insignificant individually, but when you put them together and you start drop by drop, hammering them out, right, then we're not reinforcing the status quo that we're all wanting to change.
Thank you. Sakshi, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, actually, this question reminded me of my own experience, and I'll start with that and then sort of go into some of the thinking behind how we can also think more broadly about diversity in both peer and editorial review. But first, I want to highlight my own experience. And this was, I would say, fairly recently trying to submit sort of a meta research piece on increasing the representation of rural populations across the world in psychological research, which rural populations almost account to 50%, almost 50% of the world's population, and particularly in parts of Africa and Asia, it's majority rural, right? And those are the populations that are completely missing from at least psychology research, because they're not accessible, they're not digitally included, and on and on. There are lots of issues, and you need to completely rethink how do you diversify recruitment, how do you that got turned back with this is very important work, but we don't think this applies broadly to psychology at a high impact journal. Now, naturally, I'm still hurting, so I will take a few weeks to get back to that. But I think this is very common, and I'm giving an instance on meta research, but this is increasingly common in across subfields of psychology. Catherine Draper, who's wrote a fantastic piece in Child Development on the unfair leveling field, if you will. And I guess to add to both Grace's and Anjhula's points, I think diversifying peer review and editorial review. Firstly, even if you look at our editors, they are majority located in a handful of countries, and there's an absolute lack of diversity right there. And then when we look at peer reviews, I think one of the biggest challenges is that if your context is global south, and if your peer reviewer is not familiar or is only sort of trained in one system of thought or one school of thought, that then further biases. So there are these sort of structural barriers in publication, which really require that rehaul. And I guess changing that is, of course, beyond individual researchers. And it really does come down to how we can change the system, how we can mobilize everyone from our professional organizations, like the Association of Psychological Science, or whether it's Society for Improvement of Psychology, to really change the status quo. And one positive change I would like to highlight that is happening, and I'm really excited about this, which is that even conferences exclude researchers from low middle income countries. So the first psychology conference I believe that is doing its conference in the global south is this year, which is the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science in Africa, at where the Busara Center, which is organized also partly by the Busara Center. And that is such a clear example of how we need to sort of move past and really encourage professional organizations to host these majority conferences and consider and increase the visible representation. So I mean, all to say that the barriers are so layered that I think even mobilizing professional organizations, mobilizing peer reviewers, editors, to join the cause and join the fight, is really the most tangible and the most sustainable way forward.
Thank you, Sakshi, Grace, and Anjhula. I think you all gave a lot of practical advice as well as systematic changes that can happen. And it's been an insightful discussion so far. I cannot wait to hear more. So let's bring in some questions from the audience. We have lots of questions flowing in. We have a question from Jasmine Veria, who's asking, it's great to have heard the discussion around methods and journals. I wonder if the panel have any suggestions on how, as research communities, we can emphasize the importance of non-biased samples and studies to research funders as they undeniably shape the research landscape. So, Grace, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you, Jasmine. And I think kind of leveraging the theme that we've been discussing, you know, I think a lot of it kind of lies in researchers being willing to work with people who know about context other than the context that they know themselves. So, for example, if I am only interested in working with people, I'm from Ireland, who study Ireland and who study particular populations that I've been interested in, we're probably not going to see a broadening of funding to include people within Ireland itself. But if researchers within that university collaborate with people from other universities, from other contexts, the type of funding that's going to be given out is going to be endogenous to those researchers' interests. So I think a lot of the responsibility here lies with researchers themselves, the topics that they choose to study. I think Anjhula, she said something about you know, you need to go to spar with your dissertation committee, which I think is really important, because at the moment, you know, to enter a PhD in any university, you usually have to be kind of a mirror to the people who are taking you on. Your supervisors look for you to extend their work and do something that's similar to themselves. So again, I kind of think about people who have been working in a particular area for a long time, being willing to take on people who they don't have a full expertise on, create a committee around that person to support them. So it doesn't need to all come from you, and then ultimately write grants with that person in the ideas that are their voice, not necessarily your own. And then I think we'll see a change in the type of funding priorities. And of course, the other line of this, and somebody else might be better to speak to this, is I think that there is a role for activism here in kind of pushing funders to really think about diversifying not just even the context of the country specific, also the type of researchers that they're giving funding to within countries. So again, we start hearing diverse voices and getting research done on diverse contexts.
Anjhula, would you like to add on the role of activists on emphasizing that funders do give funding to research which is not just very Western?
I mean, just simply put, I agree with all of Grace's points. It's always an interesting situation, funders. I mean, I just say very briefly, like with with stringent policies and safeguards, we just need to be careful from a human rights perspective that they are not completely setting the agenda and the initiative, because then it becomes, quite an interesting power differential. Of course, like, for example, in Amnesty, we don't take money from governments in order to remain impartial, but we have a very strict vetting system of who we take money from. Money is power, power is money. So just completely, like, I'll just say from a governance, board view, having that oversight and being very clear on that mandate and never sort of deviating from that is super important, because it's that funding that then, goes into our research, and what are we researching, and what's claiming the global headlines and everything. So it's all very interconnected. So we all have that role to play, whether you're, chairing, or you're on a board, or you're the CEO.
We have a question specifically for Sakshi. Amrita Singh is asking, what advice would you give to a recent college undergrad from India looking to begin a career in academia, specifically in behavioral science?
Wow, where do I start? Well, I was that undergrad and I guess, I mean, coming from countries where this is not the norm, academia is not the norm. I think for all of us growing up in that context, there is no straitjacketed path. And I think the difference between when I did my undergrad more than 10, 12 years ago and now is really the fact that Twitter and social media has really taken over. So I would really firstly encourage everyone who is in college to join at least academic Twitter, or X, if you will. And while it comes with its own set of problems, I think it's a really nice way to stay connected to the research community and find out what some of the opportunities are, and so I think that is one. Second, I would say, is that reaching out. I mean, I myself did a fair bit of cold emails to faculty around the world, and we can imagine everybody's time is hard pressed, but just reaching out and expressing that you're interested in working together, you might be surprised that actually there will be people who would be very interested in collaborating, just because, even if you are from a university, because I would always think, oh, nobody would know my college, which was Lady Shri Ram, outside. And of course, you do get a lot of rejections, but I think just being persistent there. Third is, I would say, there's been this grassroots movement, particularly for undergraduate researchers, and I can pass that link to either Sasha or Nikita, and they can sort of share with everyone, is really that there is a undergraduate representation in psychology. I'm forgetting what the network is called exactly, but there is a grassroots movement with a focus on low-middle income countries, and they have put together a fantastic list of labs, research labs, that you can connect to, both within low-middle income countries, but also researchers who come from low-middle income countries like myself, who are outside, who you can reach out to. So I think understanding and really being embedded in the ecosystem and really leveraging the power of technology to reach out is something I would very highly encourage anyone who is currently in undergraduate thinking about pursuing academia, because it is a hidden curriculum. And I think the more we dismantle it, the more it becomes easily accessible to young people around the world.
Thank you, Sakshi. I think I wasn't aware of half of the advice, even though I did not do my undergraduate more than a decade back. And the Twitter I did not know existed till I came to the UK. So yeah, I think it is quite useful to know that. We have another question on the paradox of tolerance. So one of our attendees is asking that there's almost a paradox of tolerance and the risk of cultural relativism in the context of global D&I. For example, how can a company support LGBTQ employees in Malaysia while respectfully navigating common religious views that don't support these populations? Anjhula, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the most confounding challenges I've sort of personally encountered is how do you promote the values of, equity and inclusion whilst, also recognizing and respecting differences in cultural perspectives. And this debate's been going on sort of in the international political sphere for decades. I will say right now, I don't have the answer. But when you're doing your PhD, right, oftentimes they teach you like the importance of the question, because the questions you ask help determine what you see. And so I guess I would ask, from a human rights perspective, is there such a thing, as a sort of truly universal list of human rights or values? How do we address cultural practices like genital cutting or stoning? When is it okay to police and practice the cultural values of other groups? Some would answer never, that every culture should be sort of allowed to structure their own morals and values independent of, sort of external influence. I think cultural relativists would argue that any suggestion of imposed values, including, right, DEI is a form of neo-colonization. So, and then you have people who are going to point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that has been ratified, I suppose, in some form by every country in the UN. And they would argue that there's a clear list of sort of agreed upon values that can and should be enforced throughout the world. In my work in Amnesty, with 70 country offices and all the human rights issues that we're dealing with, the truth is obviously much more complex. So I think one way to start thinking, well, not start, it's probably already obviously, but one way to think about it, for example, is which countries were involved, right, in creating these universal rights? How much power did other countries have to refuse? Not to mention whether or not they were truly upholding these rights in their country. Yeah, so just some opening thoughts. There's no easy answer. I live in Malaysia. I think it was interesting that the Prime Minister, in a CNN interview with Christina Amanpour, he was asked a similar question about sort of LGBTQ rights, and it's Malaysia is a Muslim majority country, and his answer was somewhat, I'm paraphrasing, you be you, just don't flaunt it so much to upset the sentiments of the people. So that was interesting. But I thought, considering sort of many angles, that's a good answer in a tough position, as opposed to absolutely not, and sort of the absolutism. So again, no answer, but maybe just more questions. Sorry.
Thank you. It was, in fact, a very good question. Grace, do you want to add anything to what Anjhula has said?
I think it's a brilliant question. I mean, it reminds me of asking about ethics when it comes to what we should have on things like Facebook and Instagram, and whether or not those companies should be intervening. And it's there isn't an easy answer. And I think that the example that was given in the question was really searched by HSBC. So, a number of years ago in Singapore, they decided to celebrate LGBTQ plus employees by lighting up the building in the color of pride. And they got a lot of pushback from the government, and they decided to go ahead. And it opened conversation about whether or not global organizations should be shaping the values of countries, or whether or not that should be owned by the country itself. And I, to emphasize again, this is a really great question that has an open answer. And I think Anjhula's point about where lots of countries have actually agreed these are the values that we should operate on a worldwide basis. For me, I think that's the starting point. But I don't have the answer. But I think if I was to start anywhere, it would be with that suggestion.
Thank you. We have Yal Nevo, who's asking about data collection and analysis. He's talking about that how there can be different laws about data collection in different countries, and how can global organizations as well as researchers establish a more transparent and consistent methodology so that research practitioners know how to research in a more global context in a much more readily available fashion. Sakshi, do you want to answer this question?
I can try take a shot, and then maybe Grace and Anjhula can fill in. I think the starting point for data collection, especially diversifying data collection in different parts of the world, is that actually a lot of underrepresented populations have suffered in the name of science, historically speaking. So there's always been a lot of sort of emphasis on ethical data collection, and really that has taken the last few decades for us to get right. We still haven't, we still are making headway on that. So I would say, firstly, there is definitely an increased understanding of the importance of ensuring that the ethics are are in place. And I just remember recently there was a paper that was retracted. I just remember seeing it on Retraction Watch because the authors were based in France, but the data was collected somewhere in either Africa or some other part. Maybe I'm misremembering where exactly it was collected. So I think there is increasing focus both on the editorial side and as well as just institutionally to make sure that with data collection, the right ethics are in place. I think now considering new sampling methods that are coming up, so for example, big team science studies, which involve, researchers collaborating with multiple labs or multiple researchers around the world and collecting data around the world. This typically happens in using online platforms like mTurk or Prolific. And there again, you see this sort of very interesting shift where initially you would get one blanket ethics in the US, and then you would sort of collect data around the world. And I think now there is definitely more conversation around the need to get ethics from each individual country. And often that requires having a local collaborator. So I think where I'm really getting with sort of this stream of thought is to make sure that in our pursuit of making sort of standardized data collection and really diversifying recruitment to reach diverse populations in diverse countries, we really start to minimize the effect of parachute research or helicopter research, where one researchers from one part of the world go into another part of the world to collect data, but really making sure that we do so in an ethical way, including local collaborators, making sure that we meet the ethical requirements of individual countries, and not just some blanket ethics that we quickly do and apply and collect data. So I would really say that this is a sort of a more shift towards slow science, if you will. And I think it's starting to get a bit acknowledged, but we have a long, long way to go.
Anjhula, do you want to add anything to it from an organization perspective?
I'm actually a big fan of not saying something for the sake of saying something. I think my panelists actually have it covered on this one.
We have another question from Teresa Almeida, who's asking, for all, even if we change the researchers, if we continue to following the models and structures that came from very weird studies, is that just leading to assimilation of non-weird researchers? What strategies can we employ to genuinely incorporate diverse perspectives and methodologies in academic research? Grace, do you want to take it? And then maybe Sakshi, you can add to it. You're on mute, Grace.
I think for me, again, this is a problem of theory, so that we take theories as given that have a lot of citations and we try to fit them to our data. Whereas if we get data and are willing to let the data talk, and actually new methods like machine learning now will allow data talk rather than us putting our structures on it. If we're willing to let the data talk, I think we can get very far. And I think the second, which actually was part of Sakshi's answer for a different question, is then collaborating with people who just know about other contexts, who grew up in different countries, who have different backgrounds, who study different disciplines, who have genuinely a different perspective to you. And then I think bringing that type of kind of, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to data, where you say, we're not imposing a previous theory on it, we mightn't even be want to write a new theory. What we're interested in getting from this data is stylized facts and looking to see if they replicate in lots of other contexts or if they're just a unique finding. I think then we start moving towards a place where we're not just becoming actually more rigorous in our handling with data. I think theory has done a lot of damage to how we handle both qualitative and quantitative data. But we're also moving to a place where we're actually recognizing that there are going to be diversity in effects that don't mean that we have a replication crisis.
Sakshi, do you want to add to this?
Well, I think Grace has this pretty much covered, but I think, again, just echoing multidisciplinarity and learnings from different fields. So I think now what can we really learn as psychology from, say, the field of sociology or anthropology or global health? Some of the mistakes they've made, particularly global health, and also some of the barriers they have overcome to increase diversity in methods. And of course, there's now a growing consensus within psychology that qualitative research, which is observational, descriptive research, should also be equally relevant. And often in our pursuit of quantitative studies and data, that gets left behind. The other thing is also, again, I haven't seen that in too many research articles yet, but it's really just mentioning our positionality and our context. So where researchers come from and what positionality do we bring and how does that then influence the research we conduct? So it's almost like a positionality statement that supplements and complements the methodology of a researcher. Is also a practice one can sort of adopt easily from other fields. Reflexivity is a very important part of qualitative research. So I think it's, again, this amalgamation of different methodologies, and really truly at the heart of it is the bringing in the diverse perspectives, and that leads to, or hopefully that brings in researchers from low middle income countries who really come with rich and wealth of perspectives, which may not relate to, and it's often really hard to find in when you're looking for a theory or research and might not resonate, but actually are very valuable in both decoding results and then understanding and communicating them.
Thank you. And then we have a question on that. As we strive to move beyond a weird-centric perspective, how can we ensure that this shift is not just a temporary trend, but a sustained and meaningful change in research and organizational practices? What role do researchers, practitioners, and institutions play in driving this change? Anjhula, I would like to first ask this question to you.
Is that one of the questions in the chat?
I had actually put it in the answered one. I can send it to you.
Or you can say, can you say that again, Nikita?
So as we strive to move beyond weird-centric perspective, how can we ensure that the shift is not just a temporary trend, but a sustained and meaningful change in research and organizational practices? What role do researchers, practitioners, and institutions play in driving this change?
I think, well, I mean, I feel like in some ways, maybe I, in a minor way, sort of try to answer this question earlier or hinted at it. I would kind of think of it as, you know, each person is sort of an institutional, in a way, knowledge keeper. Maybe a DEI or, you know, rights-based whisperer. But depending obviously on the context, whether you need to whisper and shout, there remains work to be done, right? And right now, yes, I think we need to take attention, how do you say, attention bandwidth into consideration. You know, we're bombarded by stimuli, kind of have the attention of a goldfish. So sometimes, you know, at least in the human rights world, there's this temporary outrage, and tomorrow's headlines are tomorrow's sort of litter box. Today's headlines are tomorrow's litter box liners. However, doggedly, we need to persist. And we've seen the effects of that. So it can't be surface level change. It needs to be top down, bottom up, middle out. It needs to be embedded everywhere, from law to policies, one step that I find that's often missing is you can put something into law or policy, but you haven't socialized it culturally and psychologically, whether it be in nation states or, institutions. So this is actually why I believe that every head of state should have a psychologist in their advisory panel, because communication and habit formation is sort of a central preoccupation of psychologists. And I mean, and just to tag something, I was reading a question by Fenella Watson. And I just think it's a really good point, because it resonates with what we're trying to do at Amnesty, like in terms of local collaborations. We're always thinking of the digital divide and these little details that enable and empower, that really lead to outsized effects. And it's not nice to have, it's need to have. So again, being very thoughtful in terms of our human resource policies, DEI, it shouldn't be a buzzword, right? It should be embedded in every conversation, from boardrooms to coffee chats. It's just, I'm not saying anything original here, but I need to emphasize that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. So really be mindful of that.
And Sakshi, do you want to add to the role of researchers and practitioners and institutions in driving this change?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I would say we need definitely a systems level reform. I talked a bit about professional organizations and funders, but I think particularly, and editors, but particularly funders, because even most psychology research that happens outside of high income countries is also is donor led, which means it's high income country funded. So even the priorities that are set are sort of skewed. So how can we ensure that the citizens or participants of these different nations are joined in that decision? And that goes back to Grace saying that we need to include diverse researchers right at the point of grant writing. And that, I think, is really where all of the systems can come together.
Thank you. So as we're approaching to the end of the discussion, I would request the panelists to share any final remarks before we close. Perhaps in 30 seconds each, if you could summarize the main message that you'd like the audience to take away today. Grace, we can start with you.
I mean, I think for me, if we're thinking about global organizations, to really appreciate the diversity of your workforce and have their perspectives included in any diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And I think the second thing is, I think that we can all be mindful about who we choose to collaborate with, who we're influenced, who's in our challenge network, and who we surround ourselves with. And if it's the case that it is just people like us across lots of aspects of visible and invisible diversity, then maybe we need to start reaching out and becoming part of the global community, particularly if we're researchers and we're shaping funding decisions. And the last thing I want to say is, I can see some people who I know and some people who I don't know in the chat, and in the spirit of what I just said, at the Inclusion Initiative, Nikita and I would love to keep in touch. So Sasha will put how to do that into the chat. So please do get involved. But yes, this is how we can meet people, Nikita, who otherwise wouldn't be in our circle. So I'm very grateful for you setting this up.
Thank you. Anjhula, do you want to add to this?
Whether you're trying to change the status quo in academia, I remember I had a doctorate professor who was like, I don't have time to be nurturing. It's publish or perish, right? So in every field, it's a bit, every field, I think without exception, frustration is very real. So is burnout. I'm speaking a little bit now as a therapist. The eco-anxiety, DEI work, all of it, it's urgent, but it's also a marathon. It's, not, so sometimes you need to hand over the baton temporarily for your own well-being, build coalitions with people, right? Fellow researchers or whoever, like-minded academics. I mean, I'm not suggesting silos, but still coalitions out of an activist toolbox. So there's strength in numbers, and people can also pick up where you left off. And I would also just, given the times we're living in, invest in building frustration and uncertainty tolerance and increasing resilience, because it's going to serve you very well in every sphere. And I would say my last words is, when nothing is certain, everything is possible.
Thank you. We're right on time, so Sakshi, quickly pop into the last words.
Wow, no pressure on the time. No, I'll actually like to just end with a very quick quote and mini reflection. So this is a quote by Doug Medin, who's a psychologist, and he often draws the parallel and says, if narrow sampling in medical research is inexcusable and immoral, then why is psychology or psychological science any different? And I think to really diversify, we need, of course, samples and generalizability, but really at the core of it, we need more responsible co-authorship and really diversifying researchers. So I think just a quick message to whoever's listening who's thinking about research, you are really the future of diversifying.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sakshi, Anjhula, Grace, for taking time out today. Thank you so much, Sasha, for organizing this panel. And lastly, but not the least, thank you, audience, for joining us online today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and remember to follow us at TII so that you can come for more such events. Thank you once again, everybody.